Hi, and welcome to the second installment of Auspoll podcast here at the Independence, home of independent news and bold commentary. I'm talking to you from Ubud in Bali, and my guest today is Gary McLaren, who lives and works and is live from Hong Kong. Welcome, Gary.
Hi, Kim. Thanks for inviting me on. I'm looking forward to a good chat about the NBN.
So, being in Hong Kong, have things kind of quietened down there, or are the protests still going, or is it still kind of tense?
I wouldn't say it's tense. I think there's still a few students on the streets. I saw some today. They've been out walking around all the consulates today, trying to fire up some action before the G20. So it's still a little bit interesting, but I think it's a bit quieter than what it was a couple of weeks ago.
Okay, so you don't feel threatened?
No. It's a pretty safe city. We're quite happy here.
Yeah. Now, I should add that Gary is a former colleague of mine, and we've been friends for 10, 12 years now, I think. And Gary was part of the initial executive team at NBNCo, which is what we'll be talking about today. Or rather, we want to discuss where to from here. But maybe first tell us what brought you to Hong Kong and a bit about your incredibly diverse and interesting journey throughout the telecommunications for the last few decades.
Yeah, no, well, it's been a long journey. I've been in the industry 35 years. Worked in Australia, worked in Germany, Singapore, now Hong Kong. We actually worked at an interesting startup company together back in the early 2000s. I think it was, Kim, where we were rolling out DSL for the first broadband connections really in Australia. So it's come a long way. I'm now in Hong Kong, been here 4 years. I'm a co-owner and chief technology officer for Hong Kong Broadband Network. We deliver some amazing fibre broadband here in Hong Kong with our own network, all our own infrastructure. And it's about 40% of Hong Kong's households that we service at the moment. And we're growing also to service some of a lot of Hong Kong's businesses as well.
Yeah, I'm sure you can tell us how fast your internet is over there, but really, we don't really want to know. Particularly our Australian listeners are just going to get envious listening to that. Now, if I remember correctly, you have both a technical and legal background, which I'm sure has come in quite handy in the minefield of telecommunications, eh?
Yeah, you could say that. I've done both engineering and law. I worked out quite a long time ago that telecommunications is very much a regulated industry, and it's always had a lot of influence from the government side, and there's always a lot of commercial considerations. And a lot of what happens in telecommunications is not so much just about the technology; it's much more than that. And I think we'll discuss a bit of that today. Having the engineering certainly helps, though. It's still a very technical and fast-moving industry, which really shapes the way the things have evolved over the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah. I remember when NBNCo was negotiating with Telstra for access to the cable network. And obviously at the time you were bound by commercial in confidence, and there wasn't too much you could tell me apart from the frustrations and the time it took. That must have been a really interesting experience on both the legal and technical level.
Yeah, I think you're talking about the negotiations with Telstra. So that was back in, it's nearly 10 years ago now when we did the first round of negotiations, and there's been subsequent ones, obviously. It's a real balancing act to get a company like Telstra, who dominated the industry, to essentially give up their ownership of all of their customers in a way, and find a way to get them to transfer that to a new network, a brand new network, and at the same time have that new company, NBNCo, acquire services from Telstra to be able to get access to all of the ducts that are needed to run fibre, all of the exchanges where we need to put our equipment, even long-distance fibre right around Australia. So it was a multi-pronged negotiation that involved the government, NBNCo, Telstra, regulators, and it did take a long time. I'm actually surprised when you think about it in hindsight that we were able to complete it at all. It was such a complex deal, and And it really did change the whole structure of the Australian market. And that was the prime objective. It was about taking Telstra's dominance away from the industry. But the real question now is, have we just replaced it with a new Telstra called NBNCo?
Yeah, exactly. And I guess turning to that particular debacle, and I don't really want to dwell too much on the past. We spent a lot of time doing that and keep on spending time doing that. But I'd be interested to know if you have some insights to share about those first few years. And in particular, now that you look back on it, do you think the original was realistic?
Look, I think the original plan that we put in place was an approach to dealing with Telstra's domination of the industry, and also at the same time looking to give the whole Australian infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure, a big shot in the arm, so that it would essentially set itself up for the 21st century. So it was about changing the paradigm on those two fronts. And it was certainly an optimistic plan. It was a bold plan that was put forward, and it was a plan that really relied on the company being able to get itself up and running very quickly. And being such a big project with so many agendas running politically, commercially, and everything else, you really do look back and say that was an optimistic plan that was essentially in an environment where we didn't have bipartisan political support for the plan. It was impossible to achieve. If it had been a bipartisan political project, and we actually had both the coalition and Labor backing it, we would have seen something equivalent to the Snowy Hydro system that the people have always looked at. And we would have actually been able to achieve something over a period of 10 or 15 years that we could look back on in the future and be quite proud of. But because it wasn't bipartisan, I think we ended up in a situation where politics essentially came to dominate the discussion rather than the economics or the technology.
Yeah, we don't do bipartisan projects very much and very well in this country, do we? In hindsight, do you reckon, what was there real political pressure on Mike and you and the rest of the team to kind of be very optimistic in terms of your forecast and keeping the costs down and making it all look like it was going to finish in a few years?
Well, there's certainly political pressure. We were involved in a political process. We were dragged into Senate estimates and made to respond to very challenging questioning from the other side of politics who were looking to win political points. So it became a political project very early on. And I think I fronted up to 9 Senate estimates committees, sometimes with Mike, sometimes without. And it was a challenging situation to put a company in that really didn't have the political DNA, didn't really want to have the political discussion, but was forced to. And I think in hindsight that was one of the really big issues about running the project from the get-go. And but we unfortunately still now in 2019 have a highly political project in place. Just one of the things I found most frustrating as the CTO or Chief Technology Officer was the discussion was always about technology, and it really was that the minister on one hand was trying to advance one set of technologies, and the opposition spokesman Malcolm Turnbull was trying to essentially outdo them on another technology. So I felt like a CTO that had 2 political masters that were also trying to be CTOs, and it wasn't a discussion about the reality of what could be done for such a project. It was who had the best technical plan for the network.
So you actually all, in effect, had interference even then on the technology.
Oh, there's no doubt that the Labor plan was a fibre-only plan, and that was put in place as a differentiator as it became the opposition's plan, which was a case of let's cut the costs. Let's do it with fibre to the node, as everyone now knows. And it was a case of which was the most appropriate technology for the time.
Yeah.
And I think time, will favour or has favoured the fibre to the premise technology. But it became a political debate over, sort of in a way, if you're going to build a new highway, how deep should the foundations be to get across the discussion?
Yeah. Right. So fast forwarding 10 years, what have we got for our $51 billion?
Well, not very many happy people, I think. I find it very hard to find anyone who is satisfied, let alone happy with the situation at the moment. Sure, you've got some customers that will be comfortable with their broadband service, especially those that are on fibre to the premises. There's about 20% of customers in Australia will be lucky enough to be on that. But there's now 1 million customers that won't even get 50 megabits per second, when our original target was 100 megabits, and that will not stand the test of time. We will see that technology base that we essentially have now is insufficient for the next 20, 30 years. We've spent $51 billion, most of it. I think when my last count, and you can check my website out for this, about 80% of that's been spent under the Coalition's watch, essentially to repurpose the copper network and cable TV network, rather than build infrastructure that we know we'll need for the 21st century. So the majority of the money has been spent on just a minor upgrade to maybe put a new transmission on the car rather than go and get a new car.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. You mentioned request broadband before, which probably not many listeners would remember. But then, of course, we both worked with Phil Sykes, who was one of the architects of the original Telstra cable network. And I so vividly remember Phil explaining to me the incredible advantages of a fibre optic network. As he said, you lay one cable with lots of fibre strands carrying data on the light signal, and whenever you need more capacity, you just light up another strand. So,
well, it's even better than that. That one strand you can actually put another wavelength on, and essentially get 100 times the capacity. So it's limitless capacity that we get with the fibre optic technology, and this is not new technology.
It's not going to be my next question. Is that if the NBN had followed its original plan of fibre to the home, would it really have been future-proof, or is there already now something that will eventually replace it that we know about?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think a lot of people would say it would be future-proof, but the technology is absolutely future-proof. But what we can never predict is the new architectures and use cases that are coming through for our networks. And when I now look at what's happening with 5G networks in particular, we're seeing that what we would have built, even on the fibre to the premise network back 10 years ago, was not really suitable for what's needed to lay the fibre to service all the 5G antennas that will be needed in the future. So you can never be absolutely certain you have a future-proof technology. The technology will stand the test of time. The trouble is, we probably did not lay enough fibre back in those early days to satisfy what will be needed over the next 10 or 20 years. We thought we were actually, and we were criticised in some cases, for laying too much fibre in those Telstra ducts. We were criticised internally in NBNCo, criticised outside of NBNCo, but now when you actually look at what is needed, the amount of fibre that is needed is actually even much higher than we were rolling out in those early days. So it's not a case of the technology, it's just the quantity in there, what's driving our industry forward.
So despite all of those strands in the cable, there's still not enough upgrade, or there's still not enough cable, is in effect what you're saying, yes?
It's not so much that there's not enough cable, it's the way it's being used. I have to get into the actual technology a little bit more, but we were rolling out what's called a GPON, a gigabit passive optical network. That actually ends up splitting a lot of the fibres into a lot of different branches. What we're seeing now for 5G is that you actually need dedicated fibre, and that needs more fibre to be able to service those areas. So certainly we would have been in a hell of a lot better position had we continued than what we are today. And I think technologies will adapt to make it even more suitable. But right now, there would be question marks over even that technology.
And can you see a future today where, as some people say, that that the network will be obsolete within 10 years and the bulk of the traffic will be wireless? Do you still see that, or is that still too early?
You're talking about a fibre to the premise network. Obviously, the current network.
No, I'm talking in general, whether wireless eventually will usurp it all and basically render most of the cable, at least the access cable network, obsolete.
Well, it's a question of, what do you mean by wireless network? I think we all now use 100% wireless in our homes. I don't think anyone uses that blue cable in our homes now, but you need a fixed network to carry that from your home to the network. So essentially, we already have, I would suggest, a wireless dominated network. But the key principle is to be able to have so much wireless networking, you need to bring your fixed fibre network very close to where that wireless network is servicing either people in a home or cell sites around a mobile network or in a business. So that is quite clear that the amount of investment that goes into fibre will only actually go up as more wireless networks are built, because the wireless networking just does not have enough capacity and spectrum. So the only way you get around that is to bring the wireless network shorter and shorter distances, closer to the customer, and that means more fibre. So they both grow in tandem, and they both rely on each other.
Right. Okay. So in other words, in simple terms, at the moment you can't see a future where fibre is really confined just to the backhaul. It's a significant part in access for the foreseeable future. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, I think backhaul is changing. We now have things called front haul and all sorts. So by all this need for more fibre to service wireless networks, you are seeing a whole changing architecture of the actual way we lay out fibre, what I was talking about. It's interesting today, no one actually talks, when you talk to the younger generation about broadband, most people just say Wi-Fi. And it's people say, oh, I need Wi-Fi. So we already, and that needs a fixed broadband service, but it's already seen as a wireless service. So it's very different at what the consumer sees, which is essentially all wireless, and that's the most convenient technology, and that's the way it should be run out. And so that's why this whole debate about wireless versus fibre becomes very difficult to explain in a lay discussion, because everyone just sees wireless at the moment, and so everyone would be saying, why do I need a fibre connection at all? So, but it's a much deeper question than that.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Now, of course, as we talked about before, you're talking to me from Hong Kong, and of course you have excellent infrastructure there. Interestingly, I'm in Ubud in the hills of Bali, and my internet is fast and stable, and much better than I normally get home on the Gold Coast. So I'd be interested to hear also, apart from Hong Kong, but what can you tell us about what have other countries done, and what are they doing to meet the insatiable demand for data?
Yeah, look, I think it's quite clear that the main driver for better broadband networks and better wireless networks, as we were saying, is finding the ways to economically lay more fibre. And the question always comes down to, it's a tough job. You have to get out in the streets. You have to dig trenches and lay fibre through all sorts of weird environments, whether it's in Asia or Europe or Australia. So the fibre infrastructure is the key. The big question is, in each particular market, how do you create an industry and an environment that will actually have incentives for either private enterprise or government businesses to be able to lay that fibre? And what we've seen around Asia in particular is it's essentially been driven by competition. So it's been private enterprises competing with laying competing fibre networks. I often get the question of that fibre networks are natural monopolies, and I say that is a case in some instances, but in many of our cities and metropolitan areas, we already have multiple networks, and we can leverage those to be able to get competition. And that's actually the competition between different service providers that actually drives more investment in the fibre. And the taxpayer doesn't have to get involved in most metropolitan areas. And that's what's happening in Asia. It's happened in Europe to a much larger extent than Australia. So most of the European cities now are getting more fibre because of competition between different fibre operators. And in the US, we have, well, Canada in particular, we have absolutely the same dynamic happening. The US is a little bit more dominated by the big cable companies, but we have fibre being laid by Verizon and AT&T. So in most markets, you are seeing more fibre infrastructure being driven by private competition in the city areas. And I'm sure we'll get onto regional areas in a minute, but that dynamic is totally missing in Australia. We have essentially had now for 30 years a monopoly of some kind or another, sitting on investment rather than doing investment, and looking to actually sweat an asset, restrain supply so that they can charge as high a price as possible. And it's just typical monopoly behaviour that the Australian policymakers and regulators have condoned and let happen, and look like will continue to let happen for many years to come, unless there's a real change in attitude about how we think about broadband networks. Just like we think about mobile networks, we would never think about having only one mobile 4G network in a city. There's always going to be at least 3, maybe 4. And it's the same dynamic. You know, it's duplicated infrastructure, but it's the competition that drives the investment from 2G to 3G to 4G to 5G. Government doesn't have to get involved, and we get better services because the same dynamic is happening around the world in fixed broadband, except in Australia.
Right. So, Gary, can it be fixed?
The NBN will only be fixed because we are digging a deeper and deeper hole. The financials are absolutely terrible, and it will only be fixed by either one or two pathways. One is government and taxpayers prepared to spend billions of extra dollars upgrading the existing network model to a fibre infrastructure, and then essentially writing off a lot of that investment so that pricing can come down. So we have to essentially be prepared to see it as a public good that requires a government to actually give the money to NBNCo and not expect a return. So that's one way. And the other way is to essentially break up NBNCo and create an environment where you have competition between different networks. And we still have 3 or 4 different network types in Australia with FTTN, HFC, fixed wireless, and FTTP, to actually have different operators owning those networks and competing for business and growing their networks naturally.
Right.
The big question is where will the politics go for both of those issues? The big worry I have is that Telstra will find a way or one of its spun-off companies or entities called InfraCo will find a way to be able to re-monopolise in a private way NBNCo, and then obviously without any government involvement, you can expect no more investment for many, many years.
So then we're back to where we were 30 years ago, basically, or 20
Exactly.
years ago.
And if we haven't learnt over the last 30 years anything, then we deserve to be a broadband backwater. Really, we deserve it.
Now, of course, Australian telecommunications policy has always been unduly hampered by the need to offer services in the bush, as we like to say. Obviously, not a problem we've had in Hong Kong. I lived there many years ago, and I can't remember many bushes. But how, in the scheme of things, how do we ensure that Australians in the bush get a decent service?
Well, let's first talk about Hong Kong. The Hong Kong government has just released a tender to put in, I think it's about 200 million Australian dollars to get fibre broadband to the remote villages in Hong Kong. So even in the most densest city in the world, with the densest population, you still have a need for government subsidies to be able to get fibre broadband to the most uneconomic areas where private enterprise will not go because essentially the cost is too high. So it illustrates perfectly, I think, that every market needs a balance between competition and government subsidy. Australia could raise the money to do this and to fund the infrastructure for rural and regional broadband, bush broadband, by putting a levy on all of our telecommunication services. So it would only take a 2% levy on the $40 billion of revenue that we essentially now all spend on telecommunications in Australia to raise $800 million a year. And that would be ample money, and maybe too much actually, to actually go out and have the best rural broadband experience in the world. So we could service our country cousins very easily by that type of subsidy. Now that you'd have to find ways to do that efficiently. You'd have to make sure there was some competitive tension about how to deploy the right technologies, and it wouldn't be all fibre because Australia's just way too big. But we could keep up to date. The fixed wireless networks could be upgraded, the satellite networks could be upgraded, and we could get more fibre out to more and more communities. But it does need a government subsidy, and it's just having the political courage to be able to go out and tell it like it is, rather than try and hide this huge cross subsidy that exists now and try and squeeze it in behind the scenes in NBNCo. So that money still has to flow, it's still happening, but it's all happening in a very cloak and dagger way in the accounts of NBNCo, rather than doing it more transparently and more accountability.
Exactly. Well, Gary, that's been really interesting and really insightful. Really appreciate your time. And in a way, it actually kind of opens more questions than answers. But in essence, it's the politicians that have stuffed this up and continue to stuff it up. And but I'm pleased that you can see that there may be some light at the end of the tunnel. And I guess we just got to keep working at it. So
and if we get there, we might be able to see ourselves back in Australia with some decent broadband, right?
Exactly.
Instead of being refugees where we are, we can call ourselves the broadband refugees.
That's right. Well, thanks a lot, Gary. We all hope to see you back in Australia one day to help us fix this mess. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks for
everyone that's been listening in.
Thank you.